So welcome to this podcast in our series on 1 Peter, and a particular welcome today to another of the bishops that I've met through the Lambeth Conversations, Bishop Mary from New York. Mary, it's lovely of you to join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bishop Stephen. It's a delight to be here.
Mary, tell me something about your diocese and how long you've been there and about your own journey in ministry.
Sure. Well, if I may, I'll start from the other end of that, which is to say that I've been ordained for almost 40 years, obviously first as a deacon, then as a priest. And after 20 years of parish ministry, I became the canon to the ordinary in the Diocese of Maryland, which is centered in the city of Baltimore, and then was elected bishop suffragan in the Diocese of Los Angeles on the West Coast, an urban kind of oriented diocese, but with a lot of geographic reach. And for the last 5.5, closing in on 6 years, I've had the honor of being bishop assistant or assistant bishop in the Diocese of New York, which is obviously centered in New York City, but is really comprised of 3 of the 5 boroughs of New York City. So Staten Island, Manhattan, and the Bronx,
Right.
and then 7 upstate counties that comprise the southern Hudson River Valley.
So you and I have both been in our present roles about the same time. I've been here just 5 years now, and I was a bishop in Sheffield in the north of England before. But you went completely from the West Coast to the East Coast in your turn.
I did.
Yeah.
And in many ways, especially culturally, I think the West Coast and the East Coast of the United States have more in common than the broad mid-section of the country. They are also very different. The West Coast of the United States is kind of oriented across the Pacific Ocean to Asia, to China and Korea and Japan. And so you will find in colleges and of the state of California, even a almost predominant population of Chinese and Japanese and Korean people, along with Spanish speakers, largely from Mexico. On the East Coast, and particularly in New York, our Spanish speakers are largely from Puerto Rico. And the East Coast of the United States is, I think, still oriented toward Europe.
Towards Europe, yeah.
And so that's kind of, that's a very broad brushstroke on worldview.
That's really helpful. And how many churches and clergy would you have to make up?
There are just under 200 congregations in the Diocese of New York and around 500 clergy.
Okay, yeah. That's that's about the size of an average English diocese, I would say, in terms of congregations. Perhaps a few more clergy than many English dioceses. And we've been sharing together in a small group over the summer, which has been delightful. And one of the very powerful things for me has been listening to different bishops' stories from different places in the world about their journey through COVID. Obviously, we've seen New York, the situation in New York, reported a lot on the news, particularly towards the beginning of the pandemic. But what's it been like for you?
For me, it was, almost immediately in the story of the worldwide pandemic, New York became an epicenter. So early on, it was a real crisis because the hospitals were kind of overloaded. If you live in New York City, you were hearing sirens all the time. There were mobile cooler trucks that were mobile morgues that stored bodies. And these issues were complicated by the fact that the COVID was, even at that time, hitting populations of people of color more than white people. And so many of those were immigrants or residents of New York who, in the way of the world, did not have the appropriate papers to be residing legally. So, out of fear of being deported, people would bring a loved one who was sick with COVID to a hospital, and it was tragic all around, but basically leave them there. And there were, when it came to burying bodies, there weren't people, coming up to claim those bodies, and people were dying at a rate that even the funeral homes could not handle. We've been through several waves, and right now, currently, after 18 plus months of dealing with COVID, I would say that New York is in fairly good shape, in the sense that there's a growing understanding that we all need to learn how to live with COVID.
And how are the churches and the clergy now, after 18 months of journeying through this?
Many of the clergy are exhausted. And I also think at the same time, we're experiencing just the beginning blossoming of seeds of rebirth, of renewed energy, and of hope for the future. That may be a little premature because there's still a lot of tired clergy, but we've also had, and I'm proud of every single one of our congregations in the Diocese of New York, we've had, for example, St. Luke's in the Bronx had 22 parishioners die of COVID, and they were largely, a congregation of people of color who were vulnerable to the virus early on, and yet they've the rector, the Reverend Rt Revd, has promoted consistently safety protocols for the church. They became a testing center early on and opened themselves to the neighborhood as a testing center. And then they became a center where you could go to receive the vaccination. They were a leader in promoting that movement in a community that was at least categorically, perhaps stereotypically, known to be suspicious of the medical evidence. And they were right out there leading the way in all the positive ways that we could have hoped. And they were not alone, but I offer them as an example of what the church has done in the midst of this pandemic. No,
that's well, and we've got similar stories here, and some very beautiful photography when the vaccine rollout started of cathedrals being used as vaccination centers, which was really powerful, I think, as the church as a center for healing and protection and prevention.
Yes.
So we've had the experience of being in a group preparing for the Lambeth Conference next year and reading 1 Peter. And as I've said on this podcast before, I've struggled to love this particular epistle, and I've really appreciated reading it with bishops from across the world.
That's why I like you so much, Stephen.
But I think I'm kind of getting to the good stuff now. I'm through some of that. But Mary, what kind of things are you drawing from that reading of 1 Peter 2, or the whole letter really, just to strengthen the church in such a difficult time?
Well, you and I talked briefly about the metaphor of being a living stone, which I find is one of the more powerful metaphors in the entire letter. So, come to him a living stone, though rejected by mortals, sort of holding up for us the kind of countercultural stance of the church, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves, kind of a passive inference, but let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. I mean, that to me is one of the more workable metaphors as people, I think in terms of building up the body of Christ, as the result of the pandemic, we're learning of new ways of doing that, new ways of engaging evangelism, so that we've tried to finally, in the Episcopal Church, incorporate 21st century technology and as you and I talked about just prior to the recording, engage in hybrid events, or be they worship services or conventions or meetings. And I think that's going to result in growth and building up the body of Christ. That's just a conjecture and throwing a bit of a seed into the future. So I find that particular metaphor of living stones helpful. I perhaps along with you, Stephen, I struggle with some of the language and in the letter, and certainly some of the passages in the letter. I think I said in our last meeting, I really resist going to people, and not everyone in our diocese experiences themselves as entitled, but there are some, whether they know it or not. And I don't really want to go into any of our wealthier parishes and say, well, you are a chosen people, chosen by Christ, and inadvertently promote that sense of entitlement. So that's not language that I find helpful in the letter. Certainly, wives accepting the authority of your husbands is pretty difficult. Slaves accepting the authority of your masters with all deference, that's just a non-starter in a diocese where we're really looking at reparations and racial reconciliation, dismantling white supremacy, and dealing with the effects of colonialism.
I mean, it's so important, isn't it, to read into the context out of which the letter's coming, but also read it differently in different contexts.
Exactly.
Today, I think your point about entitlement is really, really interesting, because my understanding is the letter's written to those who are absolutely squashed down to lift them up. And if you say the words to those who already think too highly of themselves, it reinforces all of that, and that's a different message that's being heard.
What's more difficult is to say, you need to become like aliens and exiles. Now that'll preach to the entitled.
Yes.
But it's hard to imagine, how do I make myself an alien and an exile to the culture against which I'm trying to stand apart?
Yes. Yeah. And I think one of my reflections on all of that imagery, I think that's the imagery that I personally found the most challenging, because I think because COVID has been a sort of disruption to all of our lives in different ways. And I think the challenge to me has been to realize I've become too comfortable and at home, as it were, in the world. And I need to be, living more intentionally as an alien and an exile against the culture. So Mary, we don't know yet quite how we're going to gather next year, I don't think, do we? This virtual meeting is going on. It's been extremely worthwhile. But assuming we are able to gather together, what are your hopes, really, for the Lambeth Conference? We come together, hundreds of us from all over the world, being Christians in different contexts.
Stephen, it's such a great question, and I hope, whenever we get together as a group in a church or other organization that has a clear, kind of transparent hierarchy, one of my questions is, what can this group do that no other group can do? And so my question to the Lambeth Conference is, what can this gathering of Anglican bishops from around the world do that nobody else can do? Not the province of Nigeria or the province of the Episcopal Church or the province of this or the province of that, but what can we do together? And I would hope that we could make a kind of definitive and maybe even action-oriented statement about climate change, that we could perhaps address the inequalities in the world among people, economic inequalities between the rich and the poor. But there's still, I mean, we in the United States deal with racial reconciliation, mostly in terms of our history of the sin of slavery, with which this country was founded. And, you know, Great Britain was ahead of us in attempting to dismantle slavery. But, you know, there is in the globe, looking at the globe, there is a kind of racial divide where lighter skinned people are either thought to be or assumed to be or take on themselves an air or an identity of superiority, and darker skinned people are thought to be inferior, and that's not right. So what can we do as the Anglican community? I would hope that at some point Lambeth would take place in Africa or South America. I know there was sort of a movement around that in 2008, and you know, but I would hope that we could be a little more collaborative, and if we're going to be a worldwide Anglican communion, let's claim the center as Jesus the Christ, and not Lambeth, England. To say to the world, let's meet at the North Pole or the South Pole or something. You know, let's make a visible statement that we are a worldwide.
Yeah. Thanks, Mary. That's brilliant. And I really hope that we do get to meet together, and I look forward to meeting you in person and the others in our small group. But I know our reading of 1 Peter together has been enriching for its own sake, and it's so good of you to take time out to share with our diocese a little bit of what you've been learning. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And if there are bombs that go off after the airing of this podcast, please let me know.
I will.